Hey everyone, I realized that I actually mentioned a card or a set of cards in the last video and didn't actually have images of them yet. They weren't on Scryfall, so I scoured the internet and found some, and there were a couple of other spoilers that came out. Man, these things move fast. Well, Jace the Mind Sculptor is back. The one-time king of all Planeswalker now has tons of competition from that 3-mana slot, and of course 2 mana with Ren and 6. I mean, that guy got banned in a legacy, so I mean Jace is definitely an incredibly good planeswalker, and here we've got the alternate art. Looks like it's I don't know, maybe CSU written in his text this time. Some of you will get the joke. You can't unsee it in the original. I will not be showing that on screen, but it's interesting to see the kind of Easter eggs that happened in Magic art. Exploration. That last one's actually not safe for work as well if you're going to be doing a deep dive into the art of the original Jace the Mind Sculptor. Exploration, this card saw a reprint in, what was it, Conspiracy 2, I believe, and plummeted in price, but then rebounded quite nicely. And I think this may represent a little bit of a, I don't want to say passing of the guard, but certainly more weight in terms of the overall demand for cards coming from Commander in terms of the prices that we see within the market. Commander players are becoming more and more sophisticated. There was a time where they really weren't that comfortable buying singles. They'd rather buy booster packs, and just the idea of buying individual cards for many of them wasn't as interesting or as comfortable as it is now. And at this point, I just have people coming in buying complete Commander decks. I mean, literally just like $1,000 deck ready to go, and coming back over the next couple of months, picking up the rest of the expensive stuff, talking about things like mana drain and stuff that they might not pull the trigger on right away. But Exploration is going to be in a ton of green Commander decks, so we'll see how badly it takes a price hit. Right now, Exploration, I'd say, is probably at an all-time low in Legacy, or certainly amongst the all-time lows. Lands as a deck not seeing as much play, at least in my meta, and Dark Depths just has a lot of potential answers to it, as cards do as time goes on. A one-trick pony is a tough thing to ride to victory when everybody's prepared for your strategy. Oh, Terry. This card is really cool, very, very powerful, vintage playable. I've seen people use this in vintage to completely dismantle people's mana bases, to go after problem permanents, or to just create an incredible board presence. Of course, that 8 mana is a lot. Very often you're going to be cheating that with cards like Natural Order or returning it with a reanimation strategy, but getting 3 permanents out of the way, triple Beast Within, is a powerful effect. And I mean, this it's got the goods. It's just not really worth anything. At one point it was a promo for the Walmart. Remember when they used to bundle like 3 booster packs with their own blisters back when they just started kind of carrying Magic more seriously? This was a promo card that they printed back in the day. So there's a ton of these out there, and not likely to ever be worth very much. Shroom the Hegemon downshifted to rare, originally a mythic in Shards of Alara, and this card is amongst one of the more busted commanders that you can have. Returning an artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield can be a very powerful effect in Esper decks, and very often a game winner, even in group games, as there are plenty of static abilities that can really lock people out. So Shroom, one of the stronger options for commander, but also one of the less fun. I've noticed even in CEDH, there's a lot of consideration for fun, whether they realize it or not. Very often those card choices kind of skew away from some of the strategies that people would really just not have any fun playing. Sword of War and Peace, what a colorful, beautiful piece this is. Just so recognizable from across a room. And I'm very curious how this art is going to fit in with others. We'll see if there's a whole cycle, if these pillars and everything are going to connect in some way. I don't know. We'll see. They definitely did something cool, which we'll get to in a little bit, as far as full art cards connecting. Sword of War and Peace, one of the worst swords. It's kind of a trap. I've definitely seen people go back to it just for a sec so I can rag on it. It's the type of card that when people start getting into Legacy, they get very excited about playing this in like Death and Taxes because it wins the game faster. And I'm not going to lie, if your game plan is to win faster, you probably shouldn't be sleeving up Death and Taxes. You want to, with certainty, the inevitability, is kind of where the deck gets its name. You go after their mana base. You make sure that they can't do anything. You don't leave the window open at all. If it takes you an extra turn, that's fine, as long as on that turn, their mana is being taxed and they have no way out. If you're using this and aggressively using your mana instead of using Rishadenport to try and get the game closed up a turn earlier, it's usually going to be the types of games that you drop. Now, sometimes it'll work, and it feels great when you hit someone with a Mirran Crusader in this card, but, I mean, it's not really where Death and Taxes wants to be, and that's the primary place I've seen this outside of Commander. Worm Coil Engine, a really interesting interpretation here. Looks a lot more organic than previous Worm Coil engines. I'm just taking that art in. This card's a big problem at a lot of tables. Huge body, leaves behind creatures that are still a problem. And of course, when you're recurring a card like this through something like Goblin Welder, it just creates an absolute nightmare. This card is like literally vintage playable, and it's a reprint that has maintained value despite having a pretty big printing in Commander 2014. Of course, originally in Shards of Alara, it was also, Scars of Mirrodin. It was also the pre-release promo for that, so there were a ton of Worm Coil engines. I'm going to be very interested to see where this price lands, especially with these full art showcase versions, as there's just a lot of them out there. The card's legit really good. Actually, I played against this. I don't play Modern very often, but I was playing a mono red burn deck, or red white burn deck, and I had borrowed it. We were at like whatever 15 players or something, so I was like, well, if I play we can be 16, there won't be a buy. Anyone have a deck I can borrow? Someone had a red white burn deck. In round 1, I'm playing against Tron, and the guy's like, oh, this is my worst matchup, and he turn 3s a Worm Coil Engine on game 1, and I mean that seemed quite good to me versus a burn deck. He gained a bunch of life. I did end up winning the match though, which was devastating because he ended up swinging at me with his turn 3 Worm Coil Engine in game number 3, and I think he had Leyline. Yeah, he actually had the white Leyline out. So I got out a couple of Swift Spears. I threw a bunch of damage at my own face and swang at him. On his turn, he cast a Worm Coil Engine. Then it goes back to me. I have to pass. And then he ended up swinging, and Deflecting Palm did exact lethal. If he had just waited, there was no way I could get past. And he just tried to close things out. I was at very low life because I had like Rift Bolted and stuff myself to get those Monastery Swift Spears to get the extra damage in. And that was a fun game of Modern for me. I don't really play it that much, but to find that line against a deck that I don't understand how it's not favored. I mean, I would personally rather play Tron. I had Burn, and it just seemed to me like when you have Leyline of Sanctity, you've got the Worm Coil Engine gaining a ton of life. I don't know. Maybe other people might know the format way better than me, but it does seem like Tron was pretty potent facing down a deck with like 2 mana burn spells. Engineered Explosives, one of my favorite cards of all time. I love this card. The price has varied wildly over the years, and a lot of that has to do with the player base exploding. Just really good. The mechanic is super subtle and complicated in Vintage when you're playing against things like Chalice of the Void. Now remember, the Sunburst is going to count all of the mana that you spend to play this card. So if you have to pay extra mana for something like a Thalia or Lodestone Golem wouldn't make this card cost more, but Sphere of Resistance or Thorn of Amethyst, something along those lines, Vryn's Wingmare, I think it is, you end up having to pay colorless mana if you want it to come in with 0 counters. If you end up paying blue in order to pay the tax from those cards, it'll come in with those extra counters. Similarly, if someone has like 2 Sphere of Resistance out, you can actually cast this at 0 and then pay the 2 mana as like black and blue, and it'll come in with 2 counters. So X would equal 0, but it would have 2 counters from the Sunburst. So I just really enjoy the subtlety of this card. I've seen people lose games on the other side of the table for me because they didn't understand kind of the subtle nuance. And I actually had one infuriating match in a top 8 of a store that I won't mention, but I was playing and I needed to get down an engineered explosives, and my opponent didn't understand kind of the different ways that the game could go. They thought it was completely locked out. They thought I was just wasting time, but I was in a situation where if I drew Soul Ring, I could cast Soul Ring and then use it to get out engineered explosives, paying the extra mana for the sphere effects, and then use the explosives to clear the spheres and actually win the game. So it was just like a question of, do I draw Soul Ring over the next few turns? And the guy said out loud that he's just like, I don't think there's any way that you can win. And the judge's buddy was watching the game, and he said, well, if he just like Soul Ring will work. And I was so livid. The guy ended up dropping a Phyrexian Revoker, naming Soul Ring after that. And I was like, how is this going to stand? Like, that's outside assistance. So that was a long time ago. I still remember it. I'm a bitter old man at times. I do remember my Magic losses and try and learn from them. And Explosives, though, has certainly handed out a lot more wins than its fair share. I mean, it unlocks a lot of situations that no other card in Magic can do. And it's also totally fine in Limited. So I just like this card. I'm curious how Double Masters is going to play, and this is definitely a card that I'd be drafting in Limited, but also a card that is incredibly good with recursion, like Tolarian Academy. Academy Ruins? Academy Ruins. The one that puts it back on top of your library is really good with this. It makes it very difficult for most creature-based decks to win if they're trying to like put out Tarmogoyfs. You can just take care of this, no problem, recurring at every turn. Sculpting Steel, a card that was largely obsoleted by Phyrexian Metamorph. Metamorph can do just so much more. You do have the blue mana, which is not nothing, especially game 1 if somebody's in a inbred metagame running Pyroblast main deck. It is preferable to not have this particularly in Vintage, to not have any targets for those main deck red blasts. But Sculpting Steel was a card that saw a bunch of play in Vintage. I've had 3 Batter Skulls out on turn 2 before, running either Sculpting Steel or Metamorph. I'm not sure which one I was on at the time, but pairs very well with Workshops and is a card that sees a lot of play in Commander and at times has seen play in Vintage. Not so much in Legacy. The 3 mana of Workshop does elevate the number of cards that are playable. In Legacy, we've got Mox Diamond, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders together. It kind of makes like a Workshop style effect, but I mean, Workshops have the 3 mana for themselves, plus all of the other Moxes that you're allowed to play, plus Tolarian Academy, so you get away with more expensive artifacts in Vintage, and in Commander you can often do the same with all of your other mana rocks. Sun Forger, this is a card that I'm pretty sure R&D just regrets. It just makes it difficult for them to print cards. Well, they just have to keep an eye on it just to make sure that this isn't going to be a problem. The fact that you can get a red or white instant with converted mana cost 4 or less and cast it without paying its mana cost, then shuffle your library, does create some potential for abuse, and they have talked about this card being a concern for kind of newer formats, not so much Vintage and Legacy, but in Modern, if they print the wrong thing, this could become a problem. I don't think they'll ever do it, but that is something that they have talked about before, is these type of cards they tend not to print as much anymore just because it limits their ability to print new stuff. A card with a converted mana cost 4 or less and cast it without paying its mana cost. They could have some type of card that's meant to be suspended where this could just be an absolute disaster. Blinkmoth Nexus. This card, another one that I enjoy the rules interaction. You can put +1/+1 counters on this with something like, say, an Arcbound Ravager, and those counters will stay on the Nexus while it's a land. They don't do anything until it becomes a creature. Then the +1/+1 counters modify the creature's power and toughness. So Blinkmoth Nexus, one of those cards that has some rules interactions which are not obvious and can lead to some very interesting game states where you potentially have this land that you can animate to just dome somebody for like 10 damage. Glimmer Void, at the beginning of your end step, if you control no artifacts, sacrifice Glimmer Void, add 1 mana of any color. A very interesting deck building card in very fast decks. It's kind of up there with Mana Confluence and City of Brass. When things go wrong with Glimmer Void, they go very wrong. Even in artifact-heavy decks, I've seen this be a complete disaster. Something like Affinity, for example, there are times where they actually end up with no artifacts. Hurkyl's Recall hurts even more. Question is, in those situations, what type of percentage points are you giving up? If somebody's able to use Hurkyl's Recall to clear your board, would that actually have just resulted in a loss anyways? And most of the time, sure, but there are definitely times where someone's kind of suboptimal Hurkyl's Recall could become way better because they can get rid of, say, a couple of Glimmer Voids during the end of turn. So yeah, this one's something. Urza's Mine has new art. They've reprinted it along with Power Plant and Tower, of course. That would be the ultimate trolling if they did not. And they've got this kind of trippy art style that they've been playing around with. We've seen this kind of style more in like these From the Vaults, but this is Mark Teeden kind of. He's always had this. I love seeing the evolution. You go back to some of his earlier work, and it does have this really, surreal look to it. And we've got Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower. And what better to bring forward than Karn Liberated? They are besties in Modern. That is one of the stronger strategies that we see. And as it turns out, they actually all piece together in this panorama, which is really just beautiful work. I'm just taking that in. That is a really cool thing for them to have done. Karn does, as people have pointed out, have a little bit of a Wizard of Oz, Yellow Brick Road feel to him. That's indisputable. But that is it for this one. We'll try and keep up with these Double Master spoilers as they come out. And as always, thanks for watching.